In integrated rangeland management, today we're going to talk about grazing animal behavior. We're actually going to talk for several sections on this, and it might seem weird to talk about animal behavior in a range management class, but I think a lot of things that we can do to accomplish conservation goals or management goals on the land have to do with understanding animal behavior. Of course, we'll talk about mostly livestock or wildlife animal behavior, but human animal behavior also affects what we can do. So I'm going to go through first the principles of animal behavior, then later we'll talk about diet selection and habitat selection. Okay, so think about what affects how animals behave. Where does behavior come from? It's not that complex a problem. It starts with some abilities that an animal is born with. They behave in a certain way because they have the abilities or skills to do it. So those things might be inherited abilities, physical abilities, sensory abilities, physiological abilities. So what is the architecture they're born with affects the kinds of behavior that they'll engage in. They're also born with some knowledge about the system. They're born with knowing how to behave. We would call these instincts. We'll talk a little bit later about some instincts, but start thinking about what are animals born knowing how to do. Most of the rest of this discussion will focus on how animals learn based on consequences, so that the learning part. So animals are born with some abilities and then they learn. Think about those inherited abilities. We've talked about these before when we talked about diet selection and browsers and grazers. And animals are born with specific digestive systems. In this diagram, which we've seen before, we've got monogastrics, and we've got hindgut fermenters, and we've got ruminants. They all eat different things because of the digestive structure. Mostly it affects whether or not they can digest cellulose. The kind of animals, the kind of foraging they do is also affected by their teeth structure. Again, this is a graph we've seen before, carnivores versus omnivores versus herbivores. Now, think about those instincts. What are animals born knowing how to do? Here's some examples. First of all, mammals at least, are born knowing where to find milk. They don't have to learn that. That would be dangerous to have to learn. They have to have some knowledge to just get up after they're born, and basically they're looking for a dark place and they keep opening their mouth, and that's the instinct, and they eventually find milk, and that's rewarding, and then they learn to become very good at that. But they have this instinct to get up and drink milk. They also have an instinct to stay close to mother. Actually, the instinct is to stay close to a large animal that's near you, and that's usually mother. Animals have also ideas about how to hide from predators. In this diagram, I've got a picture of a little fawn, and I've not had this pleasure, but people have told me that when they're walking along, if they find a fawn like this, the fawn is just stays hot. It just stays still. It's hiding, and it's instinctually responding to this, that they're scared. There's a predator, and that their response is to just stay still and hide. We don't know a lot about inherited preferences for foods, but we do know that animals are born with a preference for salty foods. Salt is something that nearly all animals need. All mammals need salt, so we're born hardwired to recognize salty foods, to recognize our need for salt, and to eat salt until that need is satisfied. So that's called a specific hunger, and we inherit this knowledge. What about sweet flavors or bitter flavors? Many people have thought that we might inherit a preference for sweet flavors because usually they're associated with sugar, which is of course a good energy source. We might avoid bitter flavors because they're usually associated with secondary compounds, which could be toxins. But the more research that is done on this, it's not clear. It's not always. It's pretty easy for animals to learn a preference for sugar without dying. In other words, they can, after their first few bites, they'll associate sugar with foods that give them energy. And even milk has a sugar in it, so the sweetness of milk can cue mammals onto that. Bitter flavors, it really depends on the foraging of the animal. Bitter flavors might be good indicators of toxins or not. And then some animals like beavers, for example, have a very strong preference for bitter foods because there's a lot of bitter compounds in the foods they eat. So We used to think that animals had preference for sweet and avoidance of bitter inherently. Now we find out they probably are learning those. Here's another interesting instinctual behavior. Animals, in this case dogs, I've got on the left, here's a herding dog. I'm sorry, on the left is a guard dog. A guard dog is raised with sheep and protects sheep. Actually, probably thinks it's a sheep. It wants to be with sheep. The sheep consider that guard dog a part of their flock, versus herding dogs, which are actually building on their predator instincts. They're running after sheep and the sheep are running away. They're both dogs, they're both the same species, but they have this inherited difference in what they feel is appropriate behavior around sheep. And of course, we humans, we shape up that behavior. So guard dogs are given every indication that their job is to guard the sheep, and herd dogs are taught to herd the sheep. So it's interesting. That's true. Also, hunting dogs would be another good example. There's some dogs are retrievers, some are pointers, some work in water, some on land. So those are often inherited behavioral patterns that we shape up. So now we're going to move into a discussion of the two major models of conditioning or models of learning. The first is classical or Pavlovian conditioning. The second is operant, and we'll talk about operant conditioning a little later. Let's start with classical. It's called Pavlovian because the scientist who really started working on conditioning and realizing that this was a type of learning was Pavlov. He was a physiologist, and he was studying an unconditioned reflex. He was actually wanting to look at salivation, and his models were dogs. You probably know this story. What he did was he presented meat to dogs, and he was measuring how much saliva they produced. And he noticed that whenever he presented meat to dogs, they salivated, that was an unconditioned reflex. An unconditioned stimuli, unconditioned stimuli was meat, and it led to a reflex, an unconditioned response, which is saliva. What he didn't realize when he started doing this is that he was making noise, and there were certain things he was doing when he was presenting the meat to the dog. And later on, he started playing on this idea more, and he started ringing a bell before he presented the meat. And what he found out was that he had this neutral stimuli, and when he rang the bell before he presented the meat, the unconditioned stimuli, the dog had this unconditioned response, which was salivation. Later on, he realized that when he rang the bell, the dog salivated. So this was learning. The animal learned the relationship between the bell, the neutral stimuli, and the unconditioned stimuli. And so then the neutral stimuli became conditioned. That was what was learned. So let's dig into this type of conditioning, this classical conditioning, a little bit stronger, and then start thinking ahead. I want you to think about how could you use this learning model. Okay, first of all, just remember that the conditioned response, in this case salivation, is very similar to the reflex, to the unconditioned response. So salivation and salivation. So if you want to use this as a learning model, you have to first identify a reflex or an innate response, because that's what you might be conditioning. You want to put that unconditioned response under control. So at the heart of this is a reflex. If you want to use this in some way, you got to find a reflex that has a conditioned response that's useful. Okay, the stimulus, on the other hand, is not similar. So the bell was not similar to the meat. So which stimulus you use, it doesn't have to be very much at all like the unconditioned stimulus. So what is learned in classical conditioning is the relationship between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. In other words, in this case that we've been using, the bell and the meat is what's learned. The relationship between the bell and the presentation of meat. And the response is automatic. It's innate. The animal automatically salivates. So how would you increase the strength of this relationship between the conditioned response and the conditioned stimuli? So how would you put this response under stimulus control? Well, there's a couple of things that you got to keep in mind. One is the salience of the conditioned stimuli. You got to make it really clear and very salient, very obvious symbol or stimuli. In Pavlov's case, you use a bell. That's a really good stimuli. It's clear. It's not found at other places in the environment, so it's really salient. It can happen very quickly. So the length of time between the conditioned stimuli and the unconditioned stimuli can be very quick. And the closer that relationship, the better. So if you ring a bell and meat is presented right after the bell, that's a much stronger, it will lead to a much stronger response than if you ring the bell and 10 minutes later you present the meat. In fact, the animal may never ever realize that a bell is leading to meat. So that the time of pairing is important, and also the number of pairs. The first time, the animal won't get the relationship. It'll take a number of pairings between, in this case, the bell and the meat before the animal realizes, oh, here's a bell, meat is coming. What if you wanted to cause extinction, or you wanted this relationship to go away? You wanted to extinguish the relationship between the conditioned stimuli and the conditioned response. So again, in the example we were using, you wanted to ring a bell and have the animal not salivate. How would you do that? Well, another couple of things that you could do is you could just break the response. Lack of an unconditioned stimuli with a conditioned stimuli. In other words, ring the bell, never present the meat. Or to do it in really random pairings. Sometimes you present the meat, sometimes the bell, sometimes together, sometimes individually, just randomly making it so that there is no strong relationship between the conditioned stimuli and the unconditioned stimuli. Okay, not very often do we want to put salivation under stimulus control, so what are some other examples? Can you think of other examples where you're going to take a neutral stimuli, pair it to an unconditioned stimuli, and then an unconditioned response? So what you're trying to do is find a conditioned stimuli that leads to a conditioned response. Okay, this is a hard one. Here's a couple that might be relevant. One that I think of a lot is I'm out on the range. I'm walking along and I hit a plant that has a rattle pod on it. Its seeds are in a pod that rattle. And of course that causes me to jump because I'm looking for a rattlesnake. So in the past, I have seen snakes, and most humans have an unconditioned fear of snakes. It's actually pretty deep in our psyche that slithering snake is, it leads to fear. In fact, it's hard for people often to get over that fear. So that's an unconditioned response. I have a fear of snakes. The conditioned stimuli is that there's these plants that are rattling, and it's the rattle. It's the sound of the rattle. I don't have an inherent dislike of rattling. I just have an inherent dislike of it when I'm on the range because it might lead to this snake. So a rattle of a plant leads to the fear of a snake. So I feel fearful. Another example would be when we use electric shock to move animals. For example, when cowboys are moving animals often when they're going through a chute, they'll use electric shock prods. And I think it's being done less and less, but it's still done. So the cowboys are whooping and hollering. That's the conditioned stimuli. Whoop, whoop, whoop. And then the cow gets hit with an electric shock and it immediately moves away. Eventually, the whoop, whoop, whoop will cause animals to move away because they know the shock is the next thing. And then that whooping and hollering actually just conditions them to move away. So not a great example, but at least it's an example of how we put moving away from an electric shock under control by having a stimuli yelling or whooping at the cow. There's one last interesting aspect of classical conditioning. This is brought up in the readings, but it's something that you know if you've ever fed livestock or even if you have a dog and you've fed your dog. You'll know that animals are attracted to the sign of feeding. That's called sign tracking. Sign tracking is an affinity between the conditioned stimuli because it's a good predictor of the unconditioned stimuli. So the animals, in this case, there's a picture here, the cows and sheep in this case are following the truck because the truck has bags of feed on the back of it. What's interesting about this is that the animals are attracted to the truck, even if it didn't have feed. That they like the sign of they like the truck coming into the pasture because they think it's going to lead to the unconditioned stimuli, which is food. Again, that's called sign tracking. What it is that now that truck actually is palatable to them. They like the truck. And so oftentimes if you're the one that you want the dog to respond to, you should be the one that's feeding the dog because they'll start to like you simply because you're a good predictor of food. So sign tracking is just a little subtle difference, subtle aspect of Pavlovian conditioning. Okay, now let's change gears. And let's go to operant conditioning, often sometimes called Skinnerian or Skinner conditioning, because B.F. Skinner was the one who really brought this to light and really helped us understand the principles of it. In essence, it's pretty simple. There's a reading you're reading for class which is called Behavior Depends on Consequences. That's what operant conditioning is. You have some stimulus in the environment, the animal responds in some way. If that response leads to good consequences, the response will increase, the behavior will increase. There's some stimuli in the environment and the animal's responding, and if that response or that behavior leads to bad consequences, the behavior will decrease. This way that the model is showed here is how it is in the readings and how B.F. Skinner would use it. On the next slide, I'll show you how we've been using it in class. I have just a little different way of describing it, just so to make the connection. An animal behaves, there are some consequences of that behavior. If the behavior is positive, then the behavior increases. If the consequences are positive, if the consequences are negative, the behavior will decrease. This is how, just think about how this might happen in nature, like where animals forage, where they rest, the kinds of things they do during the day, all are based on consequences, on the consequences of behavior. So here's an example that's a YouTube video that I hope you enjoy. Now let's take kind of a fun look at operant conditioning from Big Bang Theory. So this is operant conditioning Big Bang style, where Sheldon tries to train Penny. Let's see what happens.
Are you finished?
Well, thank you. How thoughtful. Would you like a chocolate?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Oh, sorry, Sheldon. I almost sat in your spot.
Did you? I didn't notice. Have a chocolate.
Thank you.
You're here a lot now.
Oh, am I talking too much? I'm sorry. Zip.
Thank you. Chocolate?
Yes, please. Oh, hey, Kim. Yeah, you know what? Hold on. Let me take this in the hall. You'll never guess who they got to replace you with one.
Okay. I know what you're doing.
Really?
Yes. You're using chocolates as positive reinforcement for what you consider correct behavior.
Very good. Chocolate?
No, Sheldon, you can't train my girlfriend like a lab rat.
Actually, it turns out I can.
Well, you shouldn't.
There's just no pleasing you, is there, Leonard? You weren't happy with my previous approach to dealing with her, so I decided to employ operant conditioning techniques, building on the works of Thorndike and B.F. Skinner. Yet by this time next week, I believe I can have her jumping out of a pool, balancing a beach ball on her nose.
No, this has to stop now.
I'm not suggesting we really make her jump out of a pool. I thought the bazinga was implied. I'm just tweaking her personality, just sanding off the rough edges, if you will.
No, you're not sanding Penny.
Are you saying that I am forbidden from applying a harmless, scientifically valid protocol that will make our lives better?
Yes, you're forbidden.
Bad, Lynn.
Okay, now that's kind of fun, but let's think a little bit more seriously about if you wanted to employ operant conditioning to either understand animals on your landscape or even to train animals. So what's really important is to increase a behavior in this model. Some things that have to happen. One is the salience or the clarity of the stimulus. The stimulus has to be really clear to the animal. For example, if you're trying to honk the horn on your truck to have animals come to the truck and go into the new pasture, the horn is a really salient and clear stimulus, and the animal knows that when that honk happens, there's food is going to follow. The magnitude of the reinforcer is also important. For example, if you honk your horn, it's important that the animals get really good green grass in the new pasture, or they get some feed, or the magnitude, the amount of the reinforcer is very positive. The same would be true of a negative reinforcer. For example, if you have an electric fence and you want it to be effective, you first want it to be really clear for the animals to see that, like that electric tape actually works better than the electric line, just because animals can see it. Also, if when they hit it, they get a really strong jolt of electricity, that they're going to take that symbol really strongly, and they're going to avoid that fence in the future. Other things that are important is the timing between the response or the stimuli, the behavior, and the reinforcement. So the animal does something, the reinforcement or the consequences have to happen really quickly. The shorter the better. So this is, for example, is why we use clicker technology in dog training. The clicker is a very salient, very clear, very consistent signal. When the animal does something, it happens, and you can actually hear that. The dog can hear the clicker before they would hear the person's voice, like saying good or even getting the reward of food. So the clicker technology is designed to be very clear, very salient, and to happen really quickly after the behavior to be a reinforcer. Another interesting point about operant conditioning is called the schedule of reinforcement. If a behavior happens and every time that behavior happens there is reinforcement, the consequences happen, that's called fixed reinforcement. The behavior happens, the consequences occur every time. Partial reinforcement is a bit different. The behavior happens and occasionally, once in a while, at maybe random schedules or every third time, the consequences occur. What defies logic to me is that you would think if you wanted to create a strong behavior, you would want a fixed reinforcement schedule. You would want the consequences to happen every time the behavior occurs. It's actually not true. The partial reinforcement schedule is really powerful. A good example is in gambling. Let's say you've got a slot machine. Person pulls the handle, that's the behavior. And every once in a while they're rewarded. Sometimes they're rewarded with just a few coins, and sometimes it's a big reward, hundreds of dollars, hundreds of coins. And because it's variable and because it's unknown, it's very addictive behavior. It can create really strong, consistent behavior. People will pull that handle, and they'll pay money to pull that handle time and time again because of the power of the partial reinforcement schedule. Now let's flip this on the other side. What would we do if we wanted to reduce a response? What if we wanted to extinguish a behavior, make it go away? Well, the first thing you could do is you could just quit giving the reinforcement, quit giving the consequences after the response. This is a little bit dangerous because of that partial reinforcement schedule that I mentioned. So this is kind of a silly example, but when my dog wants in, she scratches the door. And I don't like that. I'd rather have her not scratch the door. And I've thought about this. I could make sure that when she scratched the door, I never let her in. But I have to really stick to my guns on that, because if just once in a while I would let her in when she scratched at the door, then that would increase the behavior because I've put it on a partial reinforcement schedule. Right now it's on a fixed schedule. If I put it on a partial schedule, every once in a while I let her in when she scratches at the door, that's going to increase the behavior. So if you're going to reduce the reinforcement after a response, you better be consistent and you better stick to your guns. Another thing that can happen is you can just be inconsistent between the stimulus and the response. In other words, here the example we could use was the horn. You want your cows to come to the truck when you press the horn. What if you press the horn and nothing happened? So many times they'd come to the truck and there was no food, there was no consequences to that, and sometimes it just happened irregularly. So then pretty soon you break the relationship between the stimulus, the horn, and the response because you break in the relationship with the consequences. So all of this leads to the idea that we're going to shape behavior or put it under stimulus control. I've used that language before, but think about really looking at what you're doing before the behavior occurs and what kinds of consequences are happening after the behavior. Shaping a behavior is this idea that it doesn't have to be perfect the first time. So the cows come the first time a little bit, they sort of come to the honking of the horn. A few get there and they get some food, but no one's running across the pasture. These cows are just kind of wandering that way. But every time they start moving towards the truck, when the horn is honking, if you give them the reward, pretty soon you're shaping that behavior, and after a while they will just run towards the truck, and in fact, as we talked before, they'll form a preference for the truck, an affinity for the truck. So that's called shaping a behavior. You start with something that's just kind of headed in the right direction and keep rewarding it until you sand off the edges and the behavior becomes perfect. Now for a little bit of fun, I'm going to show you a really good example of operant conditioning. This is with some sheep herders here and their dogs, and of course sheep will show up soon. The relationship between the sheep herders and the dogs and the sheep is really a good example of how people can put behavior under stimulus control. So after years and years and years, these partners, these players are working together, and here's a good example of extreme skill and extreme sheep herding. If you want to watch this full video, the link is at the bottom of your page. Otherwise, here's a minute or so.
We're getting there. We're getting there. Well, that's better. That's better. That's better. That's more like it now. Stand there. I'm sure some of them are Pong, but... Right, I'm aiming for that snake over there, yeah?
Now, in the end, I've given you several examples of how to use operant conditioning to change behavior. There are actually 4 basic learning paradigms. The first would be to apply something good when the behavior occurs, so that your dog, you say come, and your dog comes to you and you give it a treat. That's a good example. The dog did what you wanted, so you gave him a consequences, and that consequence was good, some food. And in the future, when you call come, the dog's going to come, and that's going to increase and increase as those good consequences continue. You could also stop behaviors. Behaviors could decrease when you remove good consequences. This one's a little harder to think about. Maybe an example would be you've got some horses and they're always hanging out by the barn. Well, why are they hanging out by the barn? At the barn, there might be good things like water and food and shade. So if you don't want them to hang out by the barn, remove the good consequences. Put the shade and the water and the food somewhere else in the pasture. So that might be an example. Bad consequences and how they might change behavior there were some good examples in the video just a minute ago. When the herders, if the sheep were heading south, for example, and the herders wanted them to head north, they applied something negative, bad consequences, and that was the dog. They told the dog to go after the sheep. So that decreased the behavior of going south. When the sheep started heading north, which was the desired behavior in this example, then they told the dogs to sit down. They told them to go down. And in that way, they were removing bad consequences to increase the behavior of going north. So dogs are a really good example where you apply them to stop the animals from doing something you don't want them to do, decrease the behavior, or you tell them to go down when the animals are doing what you want them to do. And so that's the basis of low stress animal handling, is to really just always remember that the important part is to stop doing anything when the animals are headed in the right direction. Please think about some examples in your own experience, your own life. It could be with humans, it could be with your dog, your cat, or livestock, because those things will come up later in the class. All right, if you'd like more information on behavior, all these examples I've given, many other examples are created by this group called Behavioral Education for Humans, Animals, Vegetation, and Ecosystem Management, BEHAVE. It's a group that I'm a member of. And if you go to behave.net, you'll find videos that have been created, good examples, lots of documents that we've been reading in this class. So for more information, go to behave.net.